Greetings, gentlemen. Welcome to the next installment of our virtual meets. And it's exciting to have Mr. Ott with us tonight. He's always got some cool stuff. And this is going to be about this collection of images that I've mentioned in the past, and you've seen him in the past. So without further ado, John, I'd love to turn this over to you and take us for a ride.
All right, great. I'm going to share my screen, and I want everybody to let me know. And they hit the button and manage to log in.
Yeah, she's working good.
For those who missed the tutorial, just go to the bubble where it says John Ott and watch stream, and you just click watch stream, and it should open up for you.
Everybody with us, or is anybody having any trouble? Cool.
I got there and almost full screen, but I got all the people pictures underneath. Is there a way to get rid of that ribbon?
Yes, in the middle window or the middle button, it will have a little member icon. You can, if you hover over it, it should say hide members, and you can click that, and it'll bring it up.
Okay, thank you. Got it.
Yeah, and I'd recommend you get the full screen because we're going to be looking at some really great locomotive artwork.
Amen.
Oh, yeah.
This is all concerned with the work that I've been doing with the illustrations of C.H. Caruthers.
Right.
He was a turn-of-the-century railroad journalist and draftsman. He wrote for magazines like Railway Gazette and Locomotive Engineering. And in a lot of cases, he's the only visual record we got on a lot of early locomotives. Everybody's been used to seeing his black and white illustrations in the magazines for over 100 years now. He was unique among the railroad journalists and historians of the era because he paid attention to more than just the mechanical features of locomotives. He also described how they were painted and decorated while they were in service. And, you know, he gave the ultimate answer to all the questions we had, you know, well, what did the damn things actually look like? And I did an article on Caruthers for Railroad History magazine, the magazine put out by the Railway and Locomotive Historical Society. That was back 2018. And we knew at that time that Caruthers had made color watercolors of the Pennsylvania Railroad engines that he had seen while he was a schoolboy in the 1860s. A lot of these color illustrations were showing up as folk art. They were numbered, so we knew that there were a heck of a lot of them. And we figured that he had been using that schoolboy artwork to inform his later illustrations. We also had some black and white halftones of his work that appeared in some books that, well, we kind of figured, yeah, there's color artwork out there somewhere. And I put in my last line of my railroad history article, it's hoped that somewhere in a quiet corner of somebody's collection of railroad memorabilia, there's a treasure of Caruthers color artwork waiting to be shared and examined. The illustration I got up here, that kind of shows what we were looking at. You see the engine, the black and white illustration of the engine, and then the description. The engine was painted in bright colors. Vermilion wheels, center panel of tender, number plate, peach blossom wheel covers with landscapes in the centers, and the whole neatly ornamented with striping, arabesques, and lettering in gold leaf. But man, you know, what would that thing actually have looked like? And so I wrote my wish, and wouldn't you know it, some wishes come true.
Huh.
Wow.
Wow.
Just get a look at that thing. That was a Pennsylvania Railroad locomotive from 1861, just the beginning of the Civil War.
Wow.
This would have been hauling passenger trains.
Beautiful.
And in 2022, the owner of the archive actually was an archive. But anyway, he finally saw my article in the magazine, and he contacted me to see if I would be interested in helping him curate the archive, which has got to rank as a really silly question. So most of this last year, I've been working on building a 232-page catalog of his archive,
Wow.
which includes 194 of his color illustrations. All of them about 11.5 inches by 23. They're renderings in pencil, ink, and watercolor. They're all of Pennsylvania Railroad locomotives, from the earliest days of the railroad up to about 1910. But he really concentrated on the early stuff, up through the Civil War and before. And we don't have any idea exactly how this material survived. Caruthers died in 1920. We figure that it was passed along through his family, and somehow or another it got to an auction house where the current owner got a hold of it. But he didn't have any real information on the provenance of the thing. We don't know what the original intent for all these illustrations was. In 1920 and before, he worked on these things for the last 20 years of his life. But color printing wasn't that sophisticated back in the early part of the century, and making a color book out of these things would have been next to impossible.
Wow.
Why he did it, what he intended to do with them, that kind of remains a mystery. But, you know, at this point, I don't care. I've got the illustrations. And, you know, for the first time, this is the first time that I know of that we actually have a record of how the locomotives were painted, colored, up from the beginning of the railroad, up through Civil War times, into the latter part of the 19th century.
Wow.
Is a almost complete record. And that's kind of what we're going to go through tonight. I'm not going to try and show you all 194 drawings. That's ridiculous. But I'm going to get through as many of them as I can until you guys are bored. And I'm going to point out some things. Basically, how the engines were colored year by year, how they were painted, and up through the war, what were really common and ordinary, and, you know, what kind of color schemes they used. Because we can all use that when we paint our models.
Yep.
And there's enough here to keep somebody busy their entire life, just making and painting models of these locomotives. They're all beautiful drawings. They're very well detailed. The guy was the best there was, and the best that we can figure out is that he used his family connections to get access to all the Pennsylvania Railroad archives before the turn of the century. His father had been a big railroad official, had worked for the president of the railroad, and I would bet that he was on a first-name basis with a lot of the officials of the railroad. Walk into the office and say, hey, I want to go look this stuff up. And they just, you know, pointed him toward the door and said, go ahead, let us know what you find.
Jeez.
The archive begins with the earliest engines for the Pennsylvania Railroad. This just shows you, you know, where it starts. Engine number 1, the Henry Clay, built by the Norris Company in 1836. Wow. And, you know, we find out from this that the thing was painted in chocolate. That's pretty remarkable. But I'm going to jump until the age when you'd start to see engines that would show up in the Civil War. starting in the late 1840s, 1850s. That's just a decade, basically a decade before the war. These were new engines, and you would have seen engines painted this way during the war.
Remarkable.
Starting in the 1840s and up through 1852, almost all companies did this, not just Baldwin, which built this one, and Pennsylvania Railroad, Norris. But it was pretty standard to have locomotives. On their tenders, you'd have two colored panels, side by side. No lettering.
Fascinating.
What's behind the whistle?
You see the whistle on the that's on the forward safety valve. The safety valve is on a cannon, which lifts the steam up above the level of the cab so that it doesn't get in the way of the engineer's view. But yeah, they just had the whistle attached to the to that steam cannon.
Mm-hmm.
What's right behind it?
That's the bell right behind it.
Oh,
See
okay.
the bell, you see the A-shaped bell frame.
Yeah.
You see the bell there. But this is all the assembly of the forward safety valve. In that era, this engine was built in 1849. You had two safety valves, one at the front of the boiler, one at the back of the boiler. And these boilers were Bury type. They were haystack boilers. The big dome in the back. This is the period of time where they thought that the steam that you fed into the cylinders had to be extra dry, as they put it. In other words, no water droplets. So they lifted they had these big domes that lifted the steam up off the boiling surface, thinking that that would be drier steam. You'd have the throttle up in the top of the dome here, and then the dry pipe, which is where it got its name, dry steam, going through along the top of the boiler and then down to the cylinders.
Wow.
But this engine, interestingly, this is about the same time and the same type as the Yona in the Western Atlantic. So this kind of gives us a clue as to the common kinds of paint schemes from that period. I can easily see the Yona painted the same way.
Right. I mean, the colors are just incredible, especially on the truck frames, the green truck frames. That's geez. It looks like even everything, the blue box, the sandbox, like very cool.
Sandbox
Yeah.
is the box.
Yep.
And notice that the fender wheels are on pedestals. There's no swiveling trucks on the fender wheels.
Oh, right.
Anyway, going on from 1852 onwards, they started to put the engine's name on the tender.
Right.
Throughout this about 5-year period, 1852 to 1857, you look on the tender, you see the engine's name. This is another Baldwin engine. They did away with the Bury dome by this time, but they still had the steam cannons, notice. One on the dome, which is in front of the square sandbox. This is where they got the term box, by the way, for sandbox.
Oh.
And then the rear safety valve that had its spring in the cab itself, right in the front of the cab.
Right.
These little things that are on a lever hanging down from the safety valve cannons, those are springs. You can tighten or loosen the spring to either increase or decrease the boiler pressure before the valve went off.
Wow. John, this is a minor question, but toolboxes on tenders, was that something that came around this time? Because I don't think I saw them on the other ones.
Yeah, it probably was. I think they were probably, it was dependent on the railroad. I don't think it's something that would have come from the builder itself.
Ah, thank you.
During this period of time, I haven't shown any in this particular presentation, but a lot of engines were delivered new, without cabs, without cow catchers, without headlights. all that was supposed to be the responsibility of the railroad.
Interesting.
Only,
on top of the tender, is that where you put the water in?
the little valve here, yeah, that turns on, basically turns on and off the water. It's going out of the tender through the hose here to the pipe that hooks to the pump up by the
Look.
in front of the front set of drivers.
And then that box we're seeing on top, that's where you'd fill the water? Yeah,
No, the box is actually a toolbox.
Okay.
You notice also they're beginning to do away with the pedestals on the tender by this time, putting at least the front part of the tender on a swiveling truck.
Oh, right. How about that?
But anyway, here's another one with the name on the tender. This in red. They really didn't have a set paint scheme in this period of time. Every engine was slightly different. You'd have different combinations of browns, greens, reds, yellows. It was really just kind of up to the painter, and they really went with the idea that each locomotive is unique.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the way it's reflected in the descriptions that Caruthers gives us of the engines.
Right.
Notice he puts all sorts of notes across the bottom of his drawings.
Yes.
The guy was just a fanatic about putting in every detail that he could get from the old records that he was studying.
God, even the scale. Jeez.
Yep, everything was given with a scale. These are just model makers' dreams, really.
Yeah, they are. Golly.
At the same time, we've been looking at a lot of Baldwin engines, but there were also a lot of Norris engines being built and run on the Pennsylvania Railroad and also other railroads. When you go down to the South, when you go down to Civil War country, you'll find a lot of Baldwin and Norris engines. They were the most common in that period. Norris was the largest locomotive builder in the nation at that time.
Oh.
But Norris engines are painted differently than the Baldwin engines. Actually, Norris engines have two basic color schemes during the 1850s. And the first one is what you see here, just very plain. Everything is all one color.
Yep.
They painted their engines either green, either a solid dark green, lighter green in the frames, or they made color monsters. The passenger engines were all just painted with wild colors, much like you see here: red, blues, greens,
Amazing.
filigree everywhere, gold leaf, scroll work.
Yeah, I assume a 460 would be more powerful than a 440. Because that one we just saw. So how come? I mean, everything I've seen is always 440. Why didn't the 460s take over? Or am I missing something?
Yeah, basically, 460s at this time were freight engines. They were considered freight engines. Passenger engines were a lot lighter. There usually wasn't very many cars in a passenger train, and also you could make the driving wheels larger, which meant faster speeds.
Ah, okay.
So yeah, later on in the century, you'll find 10-wheelers in passenger duty. But at this time, if you see a 10-wheeler, it's usually a freight engine with small wheels. You'll see a lot more of them. Pennsylvania Railroad had to go over the Allegheny Mountains, so they had a lot of small-wheeled engines to pull their trains over. But anyway, let's see here. I was back at the Wyalusing, and here's another Norris engine from just right before the Civil War. This is another color monster. This one was interesting because it had an experimental boiler on it. It was called a Flagger boiler, Um, it had a rather big firebox that slanted down to the rear of the cab. That's why one of the reasons why it had such a big cab, with a steam dome over it. But then they had almost like a separate boiler unit on the top of the main barrel. Now inside the main barrel, they had a combustion chamber about a foot, 3 foot long, that was supposed to burn all the coal gases and reduce the amount of smoke that came out of the chimney. The smokestack. This was in a period of time when smoke pollution was a big issue with railroads, especially those that ran through big cities like Philadelphia. So they had this combustion chamber to help reduce the amount of smoke. But you see the separate little boiler unit across the top of the boiler, and then an open out in the open pipe to bring the steam down from the end into the steam chest. A very bad idea. That's a good way to lose heat, and the Flagler boilers weren't terribly successful, but the Norris company invested a big lot in them and did their best to sell the Pennsylvania Railroad on the idea. Pennsylvania Railroad used them for a couple of years, then swapped out the boilers for something a little bit more normal. Still, it was a beautiful engine. Dark green wheels, all that red and green on the tenders, paintings. Just, wow, and you would have seen an engine like this during the Civil War. This was pretty much wartime when it was built.
Now I'm curious, going back to that engine, what's going on with that valve gear?
Hang on, let me go back to it. It's actually a standard Stevenson valve gear, but down here, that circular little, look like a disc with holes in it. That's the end of that's the end of a spring. What they had was that spring would help with setting the valve gear. If you didn't have the spring, you had the Johnson lever back here in the cab. That was sometimes really hard to shift back and forth. The spring kind of helped you move the lever back and forth to set your valve gear for either forward or reverse. It actually was a fairly simple valve gear. It didn't have a right and cutoff on it. Once you got Stevenson valve gear, you really didn't need right and cutoffs. That help answer the question?
I believe so.
To stop an engine like that, do they reverse the wheels or just change the steam the way it goes into them?
That was one of the ways of bringing an engine to a halt real fast. Was pull the Johnson bar and reverse the flow of steam.
Okay.
That would battle your cylinder. That would. I don't know how good it was for the engine, but you get the basically the engine fighting itself to slow down. Most of the time, if you had braking to do, you did it from the cars. Tender brakes were only to be set to keep an engine from rolling once it had stopped. Tender brakes really weren't worth anything as far as stopping an engine that was in motion. Anyway, let's go on to next thing I wanted to point out. I found by going through this collection that there were several engines that were painted entirely in vermilion, like the Eagle here, which was a Wilmarth engine built in Boston. But it was painted almost all vermilion, interestingly. Another big fancy passenger engine. It was built in 1853. This is how it looked like, what it looked like in 1864 during the war.
What's interesting is all the valves coming out of that cab.
Yeah. See if I can go back to it. Well, yeah, actually, one of them was actually, both of them were railings.
Oh,
You
right.
see, the walkway had both inner and outer railings.
Wow. Wow.
Fancy engine.
Mm.
Here's another one. It's almost all red. Keystone. It again is from the early 1850s, but it would have been a typical engine for the Civil War era.
Yep.
Nice little variation in reds there. Kind of almost a burnt sienna on the tender, bright red panel.
Right.
That all metal trucks on the tender.
What about the
It
truck on
looks
the
like
tender?
all metal. I'm used to seeing wood, and it looks like it's, except for the brakes, maybe it looks like it's all metal.
Yeah. This kind of inside frame for the tender wheels. Yeah, it was all metal. They were working with all metal tender springing at this time.
Wow. The keystone.
Here's one more red engine.
Mm.
Now this was built in Alexandria, Virginia, by the Smith and Perkins Company, which unfortunately didn't make it as far as the Civil War. They went bust in 1859. But they were constructed by people who had worked for the Baltimore, Ohio. So they have a lot of looks of Baltimore and Ohio engines. But this one, again, almost all red.
Right.
Interesting. Now, at the start of the war, 1859, 1860, Baldwin was producing these blue and red and green tenders with the name of the railroad on ribbon. Pennsylvania had several examples like that.
Gorgeous.
This engine was built in 1859. It would have looked like this during the war.
Hmm. That's great coloring. Wow.
It just, yeah. I agree. Another interesting kind of engine. You would have seen at that time were Baldwin flexible beam engines.
You getting an echo?
Flexible.
I'm hearing one.
I believe that's Bop.
Still?
Yeah, I'm hearing the echo.
It stopped.
Yeah.
Who knows?
Anyway, let's go back to the flexible beam engines. Because again, you would have run into a lot of these during the war on different railroads. It was an idea of Matthias Baldwin. He wanted all the wheels on a locomotive to be powered wheels. He thought that the wheels on the pilot truck and trailing trucks and so forth were just wasting the waste of the traction power of the locomotive. So he conceived of a plan to allow engines with long wheelbases to go around curves. He did that by attaching the first two driver axles, first of all to rods with ball and socket joints, and then to a truck that allowed the axles to remain perpendicular to the rails but still shift side to side. If you take a cardboard box, you take off the top and the bottom, you just grab it on the side and move it back and forth, kind of get an idea of what was going on. The sides you got your hands on would stay parallel to each other, while the other two sides would can't one way or the other. And flexible beam engines were pushed really heavy by the Baldwin company as the best kind of freight engine. So you had Pennsylvania investing quite a bit of money in them. And all through the late 1840s and 1850s, they developed them into 080s, and just larger and larger engines as time went on. They didn't finish building them until I think the year or two after the Civil War.
I noticed a large majority of these paintings all give the name ODD and then class whatever. Do they literally mean odd? And what does that stand for?
Yeah, odd class C. What he means by odd is that it was a solitary member of that particular class. Class C was eight wheels, 4 connected axles. But then the odd just means that it was a solitary unit in it. As opposed to having sister engines, things like that. Well, this one did have sister engines. But it had to do with the later class system that the Pennsylvania Railroad adopted. Another kind of interesting engine that it isn't, people don't realize that it was around much these days, is the ancestral mogul 260s. Only these weren't true moguls. They hadn't invented the swiveling 2-wheel pilot truck yet. That wasn't invented until the time of the Civil War. What they did was that they put the pilot wheels on the engine's main frame. And again, the Pennsylvania Railroad had several engines like this. This one's from Smith & Perkins, again, the builder in Alexandria, Virginia. This, again, came from the time when they were putting the engine's name on the tender. Here's one that was built by Norris Company. They had several of them, but they really weren't all that successful. They didn't do what they were supposed to do. The pilot wheels were supposed to enable these engines to get around curves a little bit easier. However, the Pennsylvania engine did have one of these that was pretty much a twin to this one. That engine was named the Allegrippus. And the reason it got famous is that it went off the rails, fell down an embankment of 40 feet, and the Pennsylvania Railroad to this day names that spot the Allegrippus Curve. The things weren't as good staying on the track as anyone had hoped. By the Civil War, they'd finished building any of them. But again, it was a common kind of locomotive that you would have seen. And also, you would have seen a lot of these because of the B&O. The Pennsylvania Railroad had several Winans camels. This gives you a good idea of what the camels looked like when they were brand new. I think, I'm not entirely sure, but I'm pretty sure that the green used in Caruthers painting has faded over the years. Because I've got a reference of the green being a darker green. After a while, the Pennsylvania Railroad took them in hand and gave them their own coloration. Painted the wheels red, put the name on the tender, that sort of thing. But I thought it was interesting. Go ahead.
How's that smokestack work?
The smokestack had a screen up here in the bonnet that caught the cinders, and this front part was just basically a cinder receptacle.
Yeah, okay.
They had you could take off the bottom of this thing and have all the cinders come out, clean it out. But it was just a Winans very idiosyncratic version of a bonnet stack. If you look at a lot of these bonnet stacks on the engines, you'll see little cleanouts in front. And that really was the purpose of the wide balloon bonnet. It was just a place to collect all the cinders that didn't make it out of the stack, got caught in the screen. In the years leading up to the Civil War, tenders started to have numbers on them. And the Pennsylvania started to have its first kind of general standardization in that they started painting the tenders more or less the same way. You'd have the numbers in red on passenger engines, like this one. And you'd have the numbers in green on freight engines. I thought that was a really interesting thing that they did. They painted the engines this way up through the middle of the Civil War. In 1861, right at the beginning of the war, I noted in a little handwritten notebook that I had been given copies of from the Baldwin Company, something that had been written in the paint department. And starting in 1861, you started to get the notations in the book, the instructions for painting the locomotives. Dark color, no gold. And of course, that begged the question, well, what the hell was the dark color?
Right.
And it took me a couple of years to figure out that the dark color was dark umber, like you see here. I did a presentation to you guys a couple of years ago about the coloring of Baldwin locomotives for the United States military railroads.
Right.
Where I had used that interpretation. Well, these locomotives had to have been dark brown. And now, lo and behold, I got some confirmation. Because the engines that were described as dark color, no gold in the notebook, I could find here in the Caruthers collection, actually see how they were painted. Now, no gold just means no gold leaf. If you see yellow here, you see yellow paint. You don't see any gold.
I was going to ask. Okay.
That was probably a cost-saving measure because most of these engines that are painted this way are freight engines. They didn't want to spend too much money on freight engines. They wanted to save the fancy stuff for the passenger engines.
Makes sense.
John, in your research, was the practice of numbering the tenders, did you see that on other railroads? For example, the B&O,
Yes.
WA?
Yes. One thing that I kind of got from looking at all the Pennsylvania Railroad locomotives is that they weren't all that different from other railroads at that time. It's a very common thing. I mean, businesses do it to this day. If one business does it, everybody else has to do it too. Everybody's in a race to be second.
It'd be interesting from if somebody has an operating layout, is that you could actually number your locomotives with the number of their decoder, like if you're using an NCE system. So that anybody looking at it would know, okay, my engine's number 53, for example, number 1.
Yep. Oh, I think that's a good idea. Right in the middle of the war, Pennsylvania changed its practice. It started putting abbreviation for Pennsylvania, PENN apostrophe A on its tenders. and it started painting the tender flange and the tender frames dark green.
Yeah.
This was another step towards standardization, because you get a lot of locomotives from this time, from the latter half of the war, painted this way. This doesn't mean to say that every engine was painted this way, but this was kind of like a default. And another thing that they started doing was painting the driving wheels black instead of red.
Oh.
However, they still kept red wheels for passenger engines. In 1864, 1863, 1864, they started getting locomotives from both Baldwin and Norris painted green. And it apparently was a fairly bright green from the way that Caruthers paints them. Here's a Norris engine from the same time.
Wow.
But we already saw way back earlier in the presentation. Norris could be either extravagant or cheap with their engines. And this one is pretty much a monotone engine. It's got the yellow panel on the tender. It's got a pink panel on the cab. It's got a painting on the headlight. Everything else is just green.
Question, John.
Sure.
So, when these were manufactured, it was the paint scheme that was the paint scheme, and then they would send it to the particular railroad that bought it. It would probably have the lettering on the tender too, correct? Or did the railroad just get the basic version and they would do most of their painting?
Far as I can tell, the builder's paint shop lettered the tender.
Got it.
That little set of notebooks that I told you about, with the instructions for the Baldwin paint shops, they always had, letter the tender this way, and they would spell out exactly what the lettering was supposed to be.
Wow. Okay.
And often they had little notes about what style of lettering they wanted to use.
Got it.
So yeah, this is how they would come from the builder.
Would the customer? I was going to say.
Go ahead.
What would the
It's
customer
interesting.
request any particular colors, or would Baldwin say this is the locomotive and then we can detail it or whatever? I'm just curious, like, who had final say in like the basic colors?
To be honest, I haven't figured that out yet.
Good. Okay.
I don't know what kind of input the builders got from the customer.
Thank you.
Again, I've got to refer to those color notebooks, and
Right.
the instructions in the color notebooks are sometimes very detailed, which tells me that the instructions came from the customer.
Right.
And sometimes they're just really, really sparse, like that description I gave you a little while back. Dark color, no gold.
Right. Right.
I think that in a lot of cases, the railroad was quite happy to just leave it up to the builder.
Right.
And one way that I can tell that a color scheme comes from a builder is if they use that same color scheme for more than one railroad.
Ah, yes. Okay.
And in this case, yeah, Baldwin's was making green engines at that time. So I think green was kind of like a passing fancy. It was kind of like it was the style of today.
Right.
For that particular time.
God, the previous image, the boiler jacket actually looks like, was that painted green? Because the other images, it's definitely a Russia
Definitely
iron.
a Russia iron. I think this is Russia iron too.
Yeah.
You think so?
It's
Okay.
more blue to my eye than green.
Yeah.
But
Yeah. It looks close.
it is interesting to look from engine to engine. And the instructions in the color notebooks are sometimes very detailed, which tells me that the customer was happy to just leave it up to the builder. Again, I don't know what kind of input the builders got from the customer. It's interesting and see the differences in the way the Caruthers paints the boiler jackets. Sometimes it uses a neutral gray. Sometimes he uses the kind of bluish color that we associate with Russia iron.
Right.
Going back to that one with the green jacket, I'm curious. How common was it to have the number stenciled out on the cylinders?
Not that common. I think this was a Norris affectation, at least particularly at this time. I do also know that in other, I don't know whether I can find one or not, in other Pennsylvania modified engines like this one. This one was originally built in 1855, but it's shown as it was redone in the Altoona shops in 1864. You see the number on the valve chest. That was a Pennsylvania thing. I've never seen any other railroad do that. But it shows up on a lot of the old black and white photographs of Pennsylvania locomotives from the mid-century. So that was their little quirk.
Some of the locomotive builders put the construction number there too, so you got to watch that.
Right. Yeah, these are all mostly before the time of, they did have builder's plates, but they were kind of all over the map as far as where a builder's plate went. They hadn't settled on putting the builder's plate on the smoke box yet, like we're kind of used to.
Right.
I think on the fenders, I'm used to in a car, the fenders to me keep mud from slinging. But I was wondering if we were between safety and stuff slinging off the wheels. Everybody's got fenders here. Would that be what it's for? Or?
That's pretty typical of the era. Wheel covers were standard equipment, and you see lots of locomotives, not just for the Pennsylvania, but a lot of locomotives at that time had wheel covers.
Was that a safety thing, John, or a style thing, or?
Yeah, I think it was just basically keep the locomotive clean, keep it from getting muddy.
Got it.
It's you also see the pilot wheels also have their little fenders over them.
Yeah.
Same purpose. Just something to keep the locomotives clean.
Yep.
Because no self-respecting crew member of a locomotive would let their engine leave the roundhouse dirty. They shine their engine to the utmost degree.
Right.
This looks like it's got brakes on both of the trucks for the tender.
Sometimes they did, sometimes they didn't. In this particular case, in this particular Pennsylvania Railroad locomotive, yeah, they had brakes on both trucks.
How about that?
This one's getting a little late. This is I meant to take an earlier locomotive from the end of the war, but this is actually from 1867, I see. But anyway, this illustrates what the Pennsylvania started doing in 1865. They're just on the cusp of a standard paint scheme. They started to put PRR on their tenders. All their tenders begin to look alike. All the striping on the cabs and tenders start to be the same. And by 1868, you get your standard good till the end of the century Pennsylvania livery, which is either black or dark green. You see the way they do the outlining of the tender panels. You get the brown stripes top and bottom of the tender tank. All these things are things that they will carry on for another couple of decades. And this is kind of the end of the colorful era. After this point, a couple of years after the Civil War, No more colorful locomotives. Everything is pretty much uniform from here on out. But that's not where we're going to go today. Next thing I want to show you guys are some of the color monsters. You thought the engine with big wheel covers was weird? There's more than one of them. Actually, pink was a pretty commonly used color back then. Hard for us to believe today. But it really didn't have the same cultural associations it has these days. In fact, if you look in baby books, so forth, back before the turn of the century, everything was just reversed. Pink was the color for boys, blue was the color for girls.
No kidding. Wow. Wow.
And this sort of peach color, they didn't call it pink, they called it peach.
Okay.
This sort of peach color was supposed to be something very, it was meant to be very high class. Very appropriate for things like the passenger engines.
God, I love it.
And one thing that I noticed in the collection, the engines that came out of the Pittsburgh shops, the ones that had been rebuilt, repainted in the Pittsburgh shops were extremely colorful. So we'll see a few more of those as we go along.
Wow.
But here's a color monster from the mid 1850s. In fact, you see this description down here in the bottom. C.H. Caruthers actually saw this engine when he was 9 years old, 1856. He saw it in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, which is very close to where he lived. And that's where the engine was built, in Lancaster. And I think from his description and all the things that he wrote about it later on in his life, this was one of the things that inspired him to really take a good look at locomotives and start painting them himself.
I could see that.
But yeah, this one was a monster.
Wow.
Love it.
Then talk about weird colors.
Whoa.
Here's a Rogers locomotive with a purple tender. Green striping.
It looks like it was repainted in the 1960s.
Yeah. You begin to wonder, what quality of stuff they were smoking in those.
Right.
This was delivered in 1862, right in the middle of the war.
Unbelievable.
And they did it to the biggest railroad in the nation. So they weren't doing anything weird. They were doing something that would have fit right in with popular culture at that time.
Question, John.
Sure.
Was that cab larger because there was more room needed for gauges and what have you, or was that a luxury thing for?
It's probably associated with the size of the firebox.
Ah, yes.
You see the firebox extends almost to the rear axle.
Yes.
Yeah. I will bet. I don't know for sure, but I will bet that it was one of those slanted fireboxes, just an oversized firebox for burning coal. It says right down here in the description that the fuel was coal.
Right. Wait.
So they were experimenting with different sizes of fireboxes because coal burned slower than wood. So you had to have more of it burning at the same time to generate the same amount of heat.
Right.
And that problem kept locomotive designers up all night for several decades until they finally figured it out.
It's an interesting note that he's got under there on the last line off the left. It says links,
Yes.
period, worn out, 1878.
Yeah.
She ran her course.
I was looking at the following thing where you can see what the sister engines were the same pattern.
Oh.
Yep.
233,
235, 236 were also of this pattern. but the cab of 233 was painted burnt umber.
I'll be damned,
So
man. He
you
was
got four engines right there.
From little details like that,
Yes.
he puts in his descriptions. You know that this guy had some sort of inside information.
yeah.
He had the records of the Pennsylvania Railroad at hand, one way or the other,
And he was obsessed.
and he was obsessed with these
God
things.
bless him.
Yep.
And if you're in the middle of winter in Pennsylvania, freezing your tail off, and then have that hot engine and like, temperature differences must have been incredible working there.
Oh yeah. Well, nobody at that period of time said that driving a locomotive was a luxury job.
Right.
Working the railroad in general was not supposed to be a luxury job. All the brakemen with three fingers, attested to that.
Yeah.
All the crossing guards who had one leg, they're still hired by the local, still employed by the railroad, but they had to go to menial jobs because they were missing members.
Right.
Nobody expected this to be an easy job.
Right. And yet it was something that I think you check me on this, but it's something that a lot of men chose to do because of, I guess, the adventure of it. It was so new. It's not like there was a company was waiting for people to sign up to be an engineer, right?
Oh no, I compare it to being a computer technician today. This was leading edge technology.
Right.
People who worked in this stuff, people who were engineers in the sense that they worked with iron and steel and designed stuff and built stuff and crafted this stuff out of iron. They were the technocrats of that era.
Right.
And I think that prestige had a lot to do with it. Working for the railroad was a prestige job.
Wow.
This was a beautiful locomotive.
I love the
way that-
tender.
Yeah, at least the way that Caruthers painted it. The light brown hue. This is obviously not an umber engine like a lot of the darker ones. This was built by the New Jersey Locomotive and Machine Company, one of the Rogers neighbors up in Patterson. But you see the woodwork over the cab windows, the
Yep.
decorated builder's plate down
Yeah.
between the drivers. Just a beautiful locomotive.
On the sand dome, is those gold things, is that just decoration? That's not numbers, right? On the sand dome? The green one?
Oh, yeah, those numbers, 283. That's the number of your locomotive.
Oh.
And notice a lot of the lanterns, they like to have mountains and rivers with, I guess, railways next to them. It's a very popular picture.
Yep.
And other stuff, but that was.
It was part of the romance of opening up the Americas.
Hudson River style,
There's
right?
all this open country, and you build a railroad through it. It's the first thing you do to open it up.
On the side of the headlight, what's that painted there? Can you tell any better in your original?
The side of the, I'm sorry?
The headlight.
The headlight.
The headlight.
Boy, that's a good question. That's a very good question. I really don't know.
It looks like a river with trees, from my guess.
Landscape?
Yeah. Maybe. That's a good question. Caruthers obviously had something in mind.
Mm.
And I don't know what kind of reference material he was doing this from. My guess would be that this is one of the locomotives that he drew as a schoolboy.
Okay.
And he just he redrew it and used the same colors and what he sketched on the headlight about the headlight on this one. But I don't know.
It's interesting that he painted the smokestack very light gray.
Yeah. Here's another one.
Pretty. Wow.
This was I thought this was fascinating. The blue
Yep.
they put over the wheel covers, and then reflected or complemented the blue with another blue up on the sandbox. Light green frames, blue
Yeah.
wheel covers,
Wow.
everything else dark number, red wheels on the tender, black wheels on the engine. Some thought went into this.
Yep.
I couldn't really tell you what, but it's obviously something very, very deliberate.
That's great.
That's too cool.
This again, 1865.
Right.
It's right at the tail end of the war.
Is that a
To finish up, I
266?
want to show you some oddball engines. Oops, up one more than I did. The Pennsylvania had some real kind of unique engines, like this one here, which was copied from a European design. The idea being that if you had a big driving wheel, that you put it behind the firebox, and all you needed was a single driving wheel, and this would be a good design for a high-speed locomotive. It was also supposed to be used with a boiler that was set down, so it had a very low center of gravity.
Gee.
But for whatever reason, Baldwin didn't do that when they built these things. This was one of three, and actually they kept this one all the way up through the Civil War. However, if you notice, it had not only the pilot truck, but it also had another set of carrying wheels at the rear of the boiler.
Mm-hmm.
They decided they didn't need those. So
Wow.
they took them out, and that just left a six-wheel engine.
Wow.
Very interesting.
Yep.
I really wonder how they used this. But, they kept it around. It was remodeled this way in 1853, and they kept it all the way through the Civil War. This was how it appeared in 1860, right before the Civil War. Cut up in 1863. There you go. Lasted until the middle of the war.
Wow.
Cool.
So goofy.
This would have
Yeah.
been a. And here's another one. This is a little bit beyond the Civil War, but I think it's interesting anyway. You had the first Mastodon engine, first of 480,
Wow.
and they built this very logically. They just combined the tender with the engine frame, stuck another driver under it.
Wow. Jeez.
This was built in 1863, right in the middle of the war.
Amazing.
They kept it around. They added the extra driver, and they put the tender where it was supposed to, at the end of the frame, 1866, just after the war.
So was that
They kept
rigid frame or articulated in any way?
Nope, solid frame. Was not articulated.
Wow.
The only,
rear-
the only concession that I can see is that they made the front drivers, the first pair of drivers, blind. They took the flange off.
Mm.
Yeah, because that would be a very long wheelbase for that time, in my opinion.
Yeah, the only thing I can figure out is they used this thing on flatlands. They wouldn't have dared take it up into the mountains, all the curves.
Now behind the smokestack, is that so you can remove the screen and clean it? There's just some kind of wire stuff at the top.
Yep.
Yeah.
That top thing there, yeah, exactly. That was just to lock down the screen.
Okay.
You also see at the bottom of the funnel here a little clean out. Almost see that. You see that almost every balloon stack.
Right.
The balloon itself was just kind of a place to store the cinders until it was cleaned out. Another thing to notice, if you notice over here, a lot of the Pennsylvania engines did not have pumps, feed water pumps. What they had instead were Pioneer injectors. And here between the two middle drivers, you can see one of those Pioneer injectors. I don't know whether this one was one of the ones that's had single injectors. Caruthers usually says it in the notes.
Is there any idea what its purpose was?
For the injector?
No, for the actual locomotive itself. Because it looks like it doesn't have too much capacity for fuel or water.
It looks like it's got a second cow catcher on the back, so it might be, pilot.
That's a good point. It's a double ender of some sort.
Yeah.
But it hasn't got doesn't have the size of passenger wheels to make it appropriate to be like a commuter engine, like a suburban.
It might have been a banking engine.
What's that?
Could have been a shotgun?
To shove engines up hills. That's really the only thing I could guess at.
Except it doesn't have the buffers that banking engines usually had at that time.
Oh,
right. Could it be a shotgun?
Shotgun?
I don't know.
Shop goat.
Oh.
Seems to me
I don't think
a yard.
it was a shop goat.
It looks like a yard switcher to me.
Right.
Well, that could be. That, given the size of the driving wheels, the double end.
The tender size, you're not going to be too far from fuel.
Yeah, I think it's a good call. Yep.
Oh dear.
Whoa.
Anyway, one last engine. This again was just slightly after the war. Everybody who sees this thing, it's one of their favorites.
I could see why.
The engine itself was built in 1861. They put the extension on it just after the war in 1868. And look at that color. They painted Purple Lake.
So it looks like the roof is actually like one roof. It's connected. Was this like the president's party train? I mean, it looks.
Yeah, that's pretty close. It was a director's car.
Okay.
And it was used to transport, wherever the directors had to go. If they had to pick up and do their thing in Harrisburg or Lancaster, or go to the end of the line in Pittsburgh.
Yep.
This is what they used. This was their private little runabout.
Right, and interesting where they would have stashed the firewood.
Yeah.
Yeah. They would have had to. Well, the water was obviously in the tank across the boiler.
Right.
But yeah, they would have had to store the wood in the front of the extension.
Brilliant.
However, you see this big box down here.
Yes.
They could have put a lot more in there. Maybe accessed from the top.
God.
And also remember that they weren't hauling a train. So there wasn't a great demand on steam to get this thing going and get it up to speed. So maybe they just really didn't need all that much fuel.
Exactly.
And they could easily go from from Woodrick to Woodrick down the line without burning up that much.
Good point. Nice, John. Wow.
But anyway, this is fun. This is a fun thing.
I was going to say you must have had a lot of fun putting this together.
Wow.
Oh, yeah. Now, the last thing I want to mention in this, I don't really need to broadcast it out loud, but for everybody who's interested.
Hold on. Should I just stop you want me to stop the video, the recording?
Not necessarily.
Okay.
I mean, there's not that many. There's not that many people here. But if you go to the group's IO site and go into the file section and get into my folder.
Oh, right.
there is a PDF of the catalog that I made with all 194 engines in it. And you can either download the low resolution version or the high resolution version. I've made the presentation tonight off of the high resolution pictures. But anyway, they're all there.
Where is he, sir?
It's in the Groups IO file section of our group. You go into.
I got an email telling me about it.
There's a folder with my name on it, and you can get in there and get one of the PDFs.
Cool.
John, is this available as a book to give as a gift?
Not yet. Not yet. It is. Remember that. To give you a little bit more backstory, I made this for the guy that owns the pieces. He got a hold of a book dealer in Pennsylvania, or in Philadelphia, a rare book dealer. And we jointly put together this catalog for him. And the book dealer is using the catalog to go around and see if we can shop for a new home for these pieces. The owner of the archive wants to remain private and anonymous. He's obviously very well heeled. So I can't tell too much of the story, but they are looking for a new home for the collection.
Wow.
Hopefully it will be a museum or a library or some sort of a railroad archive. But for the time being, they're quite happy with my PDF, and they're sending that around to make up interest in this. So you guys aren't the only ones who have the catalog. That's why I feel good about showing it. But it's not made into an actual book yet.
Yeah.
Nobody can go out. Not everybody can just go out and buy it.
Right. So John.
Yeah. Well, John, when you talked about Caruthers, I had my computer up and I just did a quick search. Sotheby's is selling 2 pictures, and it looks like you were talking about his younger days. Look in the chat. I sent it in the chat if you haven't seen that yet. You guys, look at the chat.
I have seen it. That's actually it's actually a redo. Sotheby's sold these things several years back, almost a decade ago, and a couple of them are back, and they're trying to find another owner for them. But yeah, those are Caruthers' student work. The story goes that he lived outside of Pittsburgh. His father at that time was running one of the giant coal companies that the Pennsylvania Railroad had. And they were a well-to-do family, and they put him on the train every morning to go into Pittsburgh and attend the fairly elite school. And so he spent probably a good portion of his day waiting for trains and watching the trains go through. And while he did that, he made these sketches and watercolors of the engines, and he numbered them all consecutively. He got into the habit of numbering his drawings, and he kept that habit his entire life. That's why these drawings are labeled 300, 400, 500. Is in the catalog. So we know that he did many of these sketches and so far that I can tell, it's maybe like 6 or 8 have shown up in Sotheby's auctions over the last few years.
And the way this is all came about is because the gentleman that owns these read an article that you wrote. Is that right?
Yeah, I wrote an article on Caruthers back in 2018, basically focusing on his black and white work. He wrote dozens of articles in the old railroad magazines from a period of about 1995 through 1920, or up to 1920 when he died. They were all history-oriented articles describing the locomotives that he saw when he was young.
Wow.
And he illustrated them with the black and white drawings, of course. That's the only thing they could print back then. Illustrated it with his black and white drawings. And it just occurred to me that this guy was really significant. His drawings have been copied and recopied and redone by books and other historians ever since. And I thought it would be a nice thing to do a article on him.
Wow.
At the time, I was researching locomotive builders for my own book. And so I just kind of shifted gears. Instead of looking at builders in the census records and so forth, I started looking at Caruthers. I found out a lot about it,
Right.
which I put into the article. And I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, the last sentence I put in the thing is that I hope that his color work had survived and will appear someday. Well, 4 or 5 years went by, nothing happened. I figured, that was a vain wish. Out of the blue, I got a phone call from the owner of the archives.
That's a thing. Wow.
Who said, "Hey, I want to show you something," and that started this whole adventure.
Yeah, I tell you, you never know. You write an article, and you just never know. I think that's such a testament to putting things out there in the universe, whether we write or photograph or something, and you never know what connection you're going to make that opens up this unknown zone that existed. That's cool, John. Jeez.
It landed the right hand, John.
Did Caruthers do anything similar for other railroad subjects, or was it just the locomotives?
Just locomotives. He also did lots of drawings on other Pennsylvania railroads, like the Reading or Lackawanna. He drew some from the B&O. He was pretty eclectic with black and white stuff, but I haven't seen any color work from anything other than his Pennsylvania railroad locomotives.
Those are pen and ink drawings?
And they're actually ink watercolor, ink pencil and watercolor.
Oh, jeez. One of the toughest mediums to work with. Man. Wow, that's cool. That's great.
He was a good draftsman. I mean, you could just tell by looking at his locomotive drawings.
Right.
He knew exactly what he was drawing.
Wow.
He had good reference, and he rendered it better than practically anybody else.
Right.
With the watercolors, you know that he was mixing colors to get an accurate color too. So,
yeah.
Those are just standard watercolors that you could buy at a store.
Right. And he was all self-taught, as far as you know, right, John?
No, I think he was trained.
As a painter?
If not as a painter, as a draftsman.
Ah, okay.
Wow.
It's kind of hard to imagine that he wasn't employed by a builder to do lithographs.
Yeah, well, by the time he was an adult, lithographs were out of style. They had been superseded by photography.
Right.
Starting at the end of the Civil War, they started to figure out how they could mass produce photographs, and all of a sudden, all the builders just shifted to photographs, and that was the big new thing.
Okay.
The last color lithograph that I know about was printed, I think, in 1869.
Wow. That early.
And there weren't very many after the war. Everybody was doing photographs.
Yep.
And they were, you know, all the big builders were using those instead of the old lithographs,
Right.
old-fashioned lithographs.
Right. Technology takes another leap. Yes.
And as to why Caruthers didn't work for the railroads, I don't know. It's a good question. He lived in Philadelphia. He could have worked for the Pennsylvania Railroad, as he might have on occasion, but that wasn't his full-time job. He was actually the editor of several other trade magazines, but none of them had anything to do with railroads.
Wow. Well, John.
He liked his role as an observer, assumingly.
What was that, Austin?
Just mention, I guess he enjoyed his role as an observer only.
Hmm.
Yeah, he may have been very happy just to use that as his hobby,
Right.
so-called.
Right.
Although a lot of us know that our hobbies can be rather engulfing of our lives. He obviously did with him. All these drawings that I showed you, all 194 of them, they're all dated. The guy was extremely detail-minded, as well as having sequential numbers. He wrote down the date that he drew the thing. He wrote down the date that he put on the notes. And he wrote down the third date, said when he colored the thing. And you could just, I can trace exactly what the guy did practically on a calendar from the time he began this collection in the early 1890s up through the time when he must have gotten a little bit too on in years to continue them in the late 19 teens. He never finished the collection, interestingly enough. From the 1870s through the 1880s, the collection is really sparse on Pennsylvania Railroad locomotives. He didn't draw them all. I think he had a plan in mind to do everything up to his present day, because he did do some, to him, present day locomotives, but he never filled in the gaps. So I think he ended his life without having realized the scheme of drawing the entire Pennsylvania locomotive fleet from the beginning to the present day.
DC, do you want to say something?
I was going to ask, since the drawings are numbered, did you get a sense of how long it took him, the dates between one drawing and the next one in the series?
Days.
Days.
He'd finish one drawing, set it aside, start another one.
And that was a matter of days.
Just a matter of days. It kind of reminds me of it reminds me of what we do with with modeling projects. We get done with one modeling project, put it aside, and start another modeling project. Well, he did the same thing with locomotives and his drawings of locomotives.
Right.
But days to produce those. Wow.
Yeah. It's taking me days just to build this tripod. God. John, I can't thank you enough, man. I can't thank you enough. This has been great. Love it.
Fantastic.
I just went on the IO site under files. I see you have cardstock car construction. At the IO site, go to files. Where do I find this?
website goes to files. If you scroll down, I think on the second page of the file section,
It's on the
There's
second
a
page,
folder.
third from the top.
and there's a folder with my name on it.
Okay.
And then the PDFs are labeled CHC.
Right. Right.
Okay.
Or CH Caruthers. And there's one that's low resolution and one that's high resolution.
Okay.
Because I want you to have patience to download.
Yeah. Thank you for that, man. Jeez.
Thank
what
you so much for providing that, John.
Thank you.
Austin.
Yeah, well, have fun with it.
Yeah.
It's just something you can get lost in for hours.
I know the locomotives you can build. God.
Yeah.
Daniel,
Now,
Austin, thanks so much for making this happen again. Appreciate it, guys.
Thank you. Anytime.
Well, thank you all for the patience for wanting to deal with this platform. I know it's a little helter skelter sometimes, but thank you all for putting in the time.
Yeah.
And before we finish off, I'm just going to put out the obligatory message. Feel free to come join us in a call club. We're usually here anytime if you want. If you just want to hang out, it don't matter. We're usually up somewhere in the server. Feel free to join the calls.
Thank you, buddy. Thank you. And gentlemen, great to see you all. Have a very, very great holiday and a lot of cheer. And see you in January when we got Chris Gerlach up, and we'll be doing Zoom for that one. So you'll be updated, of course, before then. All the best, brothers.
Thank you.
Thank you again, John.
Thank you.
Thanks, Tom.
Amazing.
You bet.
Thank you, John. Well done.
Very well done.